Hello everyone, my name is Menno. Welcome to Menno's Chess channel. Today we'll be analyzing yet another club game. This time I was playing white against the French defense, against a fellow club player of mine of the intermediate level, and I was in a completely winning position throughout practically the entire game, yet I managed to lose, so it was a lost victory. I'll show you the game, I'll show you what happened, I'll show you my thought process, and I hope you can learn something from this, or enjoy the video. Hopefully both. Let's begin. I started out with my favorite first move, which is 1e4, the choice of every chess romantic. You open the queen, you open the king's bishop, and you can play f4 or d4, depending on your playing style. Now, this grabs space in the center, and the most common responses of black, involve e5 and c5. These moves both prevent d4 in the sense that with both of these moves, the pawns are able to take back. The French defense, however, is a move where you let white take what is called the ideal pawn center, with pawns on d4 and e4, but you strike back immediately. Now, my favorite move against this is pawn to e5, grabbing space in the center and on the king's side, preventing this knight from developing, and the only downside is that this pawn will be weakened if not for a solid pawn defending it. So the most regular move, we'll see, is c5, striking back at my pawn center, after which white plays c3, and most of the game will revolve around pressuring this pawn and trying to keep your space advantage and attacking where you have the most space, which is on the king's side in this case. But my opponent did not play the main line. Instead, he played the move f5, which opens lines to his king and to his queen, and well, it kind of doesn't disturb this pawn, because this pawn is here, and this pawn is here, so you cannot kind of fight my pawn there. My pawn on e5 will surely stay here, because you have to first remove the d4 pawn, as of course sacrificing a piece for this pawn doesn't really make that much sense. So, because I recognize that taking en passant would simply give away my space advantage and would allow him to develop his knight with an open f-file to attack me, I did not play en passant, even though of course it's always the best move. Instead, I played knight to f3, preparing bishop to g5, as this pawn can no longer go to f6, blocking the attack. My opponent played g6, a strange move, clamping down on some light squares, defending this pawn, so I went bishop to g5, gaining a tempo on his queen, and my position is already better. Now, what I expected was him to go here, and he did. The reason why this is a good move is because these dark squares are the ones where white has control through this bishop, which he wants to trade, and at the same time, you are developing a piece. So the best move here is to play bishop to e3, and now you could argue that this bishop is misplaced, as many of its squares have been taken away. But this wasn't the move I chose to play. Instead, I played a different move, which the engine also likes, which is to play h4. And the point of this is to maintain something on g5. If he were to take, I would take back with the pawn, and my space advantage and kingside clampdown would be decisive, as there isn't really a good way to remove all these pawns. I would break on c4 and then start attacking all his weaknesses. Instead, he did not take my bishop. He played h5. This move prevents my h-pawn from moving forwards, which was my plan originally, but I expected him to play h6, which would remove my piece. Luckily, this pawn is defended sufficiently, so I'm not obliged to trade, so I'd move back my bishop to e3, planning to play queen d2, pressuring his king side where my pawn in h4 combined with all my pieces here would be very worrisome. Instead, as you have seen, he played h5, and now I have an even bigger advantage because now there's no way for him to convincingly remove any of my pieces. So I played knight b to d2. And the point of this move is that if he were to take my bishop, I would take back with my knight, and I would have yet another knight to come to f3 to support my knight and replace it if possible. Or well, if needed. So he took my bishop, and I took back with the piece, because it's a very nice place, controlling squares near the king and pressuring this weakness. And he played knight to h6, intending to go to f7 and trading off my knight. Now, the best move is knight to f3, where if the knight were to go there, you could simply go, and I'll show you, queen to d2, preparing long castles, or rook to c1, and then if they take your knight, you can take back with your knight, and you will still be able to pressure his king side. But in a lapse of idiocy, I decided that knight to b3 would be a better idea. And this is not a bad move, as if he goes knight to f7, which he did, I can either go back when his king side is still clamped down upon, or, which was my choice, I could take his knight, attacking both his queen and his rook, forcing his king to take, where his king will always be stuck defending his weaknesses. My plan was to go for a c4 break and to attack his pawn weaknesses. So, I played queen d2, threatening to infiltrate on the dark squares, and this plan is very dangerous and promising for me, because this pawn supports a queen coming here. The king cannot defend this on its own, and there is no more dark squared bishop. That's what I counted on. The secondary idea of this move is to long castle, and to keep a square free from my bishop. He played queen e7, later on allowing him to connect his rooks and simply developing. I played an accuracy. Rook c1 here is the best move, gunning for c4, and then if they don't take, you take, and you're able to attack down the c-file. Instead, I castled, thinking that having a safe king would be a very nice imbalance, which would shift the game to my favor. And I was correct, but I did lose a part of my advantage, because having the king on c1 instead of the rook means that if I want to break on the c-file, I'll first have to move my king to b1, my rook to c1, and that takes 2 moves extra, not even counting the castling move, so this move was rather slow. But since I have space and slightly better development, I still have an advantage. He played c6, finishing what's called a stonewall structure, where he clamps down on many squares. Since I have a light squared bishop, my bishop isn't really able to go anywhere, as you can see. And I played c4. Now, the reason why I played c4 is because allowing b5 would mean that the c4 pawn break would make no sense ever, and he could attack me on the queen side. The best move here is to take, and then after I take back, the seemingly obvious move b5 is answered by bishop to e2, where this pawn turns into a huge weakness and is backwards, so he cannot play this. Instead, he plays this, where if the pawn is taken, you run into some issues. He did not take the pawn, however. Instead, he played the move rook to h7, defending the 7th rank, but also abandoning the last rank. He said this move was a defensive one, preparing for an attack. So, I attacked. I took his pawn, and he took back with the e-pawn, not opening the c-file for my pieces, which was originally my plan. Noticing that my pawn here was doing a very good job of pressuring his position, noticing that my rook could come here, I decided that adding some more spice to the e6 square, some more pressure, would be good. So I played knight to c5. The point of this move is that if the king does not move, I can later play e6 check, which is even better when it is supported by even more pieces. Even sacrificing this pawn wouldn't be that bad, considering that an open e-file with my current space advantage and his push pawns would mean that I could easily invade all of his weaknesses. He played king to e8, which isn't a very good move, as now his queen and king are on one diagonal. And now the best move would have been e6, where he cannot develop on this square, so I'm clamping down on his queen side. If he goes knight a6, I can take twice, so that does not look like it's a very good idea. But well, I can take twice, though I don't think I should. But I do open many files, and after these moves, it does not look very good for him, as I will get very nice play on either the king side or on the queen side. Instead, if he had taken the pawn, I would have played rook e1, where his bishop is pinned to his queen, and if the bishop moves, the queen is pinned to the king. So I would win a piece here, and as you can see, Stockfish thinks this is so winning that you might as well resign. I didn't play this, however, even though the idea did actually occur to me. Instead, I played bishop to e2, opting for a plan of rook d to g1, f3 and g4, securing more space and an open file on the king side. My opponent played knight d7, wanting to trade off my knight, so I did not want this to happen. I moved my knight, intending to go to f4, targeting this weakness. He played knight to f8, defending his pawn in advance, and now I decided to attack this pawn, basically gluing this knight to defending. So he, knowing that his h7 rook didn't really have much of an aggressive future, played rook to g7, liberating his knight. So I played f3, preparing the g4 pawn break. My opponent played a6, a move which I thought would prepare b5, which would be rather slow as my attack comes way earlier. I played rook d to g1, wanting my h-rook to keep defending the pawn, which is being attacked. And now my opponent played knight to e6, wanting to trade pieces. And now, usually, when you have a space advantage, you do not want to trade pieces. The reason why is you can use space for a decisive attack when control of the squares near your opponent's king can help you to introduce more and more threats using the control you have over the opponent's home territory. In this case, however, I've already prepared a decisive attack, which would win me the endgame, considering that I have much space. This pawn is passed, and this piece is very passive, while this bishop here is locked in by having all of black's pawns on light squares, which means that its mobility is restricted because you can't fly through your own pawns. So I didn't mind the trade. I knew the endgame would be good. So I played g4. Now, if he doesn't trade, it would turn bad. So he traded. And now my queen was even more active. And now he played bishop to e6, trying to activate this piece. But activating this piece would take one move extra, which is king here or king here, of which, of course, moving your king here is the best move, considering all my pieces are here, and moving the king here would block some of the queens and bishops and rooks activity. My opponent, or well, it was my move, I did not choose to take this pawn, as activating his bishop and him defending his own pawn wouldn't really serve my purposes. So instead I opted to take the h-pawn. He has to take back, or else I'd win a pawn and the file. And now I played a great move, in my opinion, even though the computer does not recommend it, which is rook to g5. The idea is that if he takes with the rook, I will have a passed pawn. I'll also be attacking this pawn, which I can attack 2 more times. And this is exactly what happened. My opponent decided out of sheer panic that he needed to trade my pieces, but this gave me an edge. Because now this pawn is hanging, so he has to defend. I will attack and block the pawn with my queen. He has to defend it again. And now because my bishop is attacking the pawn through my own pawn, I decided to move my pawn, fixing the structure, defending my 2 passed pawns, and attacking this pawn. And now, because the king is here and not on the 7th rank, like here or here, this rook cannot join in and defend, and that proved decisive. He couldn't defend, so I took the pawn after he moved his king. And we traded, because when you trade, an extra pawn becomes a bit less critical, because having more pieces means being able to coordinate better against your opponent and being able to shepherd your pawn in a way which provides more pressure. He played rook to g8 when his rook exerts pressure on my g-pawn, which is defended. And the good thing about my position is that all these files are either closed or only semi-open, while the only square which is truly open is the square where my rook is. So he does not have any access into my position. So, looking at these two weaknesses, I decided that attacking one of them would be to my benefit. So the only way to get there would be to go to h7 first, which comes with check. So, rook to h7 check. And now the computer recommends sacrificing the pawn when your position is still very bad. But he, because he's a human, played king to c8, defending the pawn which I was attacking through his king. Now, the best move would have been rook to f7, attacking his f-pawn. But I did not play this. Instead, I blundered. I went for an idea where I play e6 and e7, and then g6 and g7, and after some moves, I lost my piece. Well, not my piece, but I lost my extra pawn, I lost my passed pawns, and eventually this pawn became a passer, which killed me. It's very sad how it happened, considering that this position was completely crushing. So, what I've learned from this is, if you think you have some kind of tactic, always calculate it all the way through, consider all legal moves, and don't let yourself be swayed by previous successes. You still have a position to win. You still have a king to checkmate, an opponent to demoralize and beat senseless. You have to keep fighting or risk throwing it all away after spending so much time and so much energy calculating. So, the lesson is, don't let psychology beat you. Instead, play good moves, finish your game, and don't fall into the same mental trap as I did. Thank you for watching this video. I hope you learned something from this. I enjoyed making it. If you have any suggestions, any tips, any comments in general, please comment down below, and I'll see you in my next video. Bye bye.